related to other things we think about, I don't think that the biological model of addiction is well intended. I certainly don't think it has good effects. I'm starting to talk about the big lie of the genetics of alcoholism or the big lie of the disease theory of addiction. And I want to tell three stories in doing that. You know the platform Medium, you've written for it. A guy was writing about Joe Biden deciding never to drink in his life. It made me think about my own family. Like Biden's, my extended family tree is filled with addicts, mostly alcoholics and smokers. Although neither of my parents are heavy drinkers, I knew when growing up that their own parents, my grandparents, were. I also knew that many cousins and other relatives who would struggle with addiction. My parents even explicitly warned me that addiction ran in our family. Despite this, I started drinking anyway. It should come as no surprise that I developed an addiction very quickly. It's not fair to pull this on you. I don't know if you remember 10th grade biology. What gene is he describing? When he says neither of his parents were heavy drinkers, that implies that they drank moderately.
Right.
What's it called when you inherit a trait not from your parents? What do they call that?
Is it recessive?
Yes. All right, Zach.
Now we're on.
So, he's misusing genetics.
Yeah.
He's imagining that there's a
This isn't
genetic
blue eyes.
explanation for the fact, well, of course I became addicted. Oh, I inherited it. It's genetic. Oh,
Yeah.
neither of my parents had it. So that describes something very specific, a recessive gene. There is no gene for addiction. There is no recessive gene for addiction. And I just want to, I did a pretty good thing on that in my memoir, so I might want to just read it from then.
Before you do, can I ask you, even though he's wrong, what is the gene that, I forget what it's called, that people are always talking, like Dr. Drew will say, well, if you have the gene, and then they name something that they think is linked straight genetically. What is he saying? Do you remember what it's called?
Well, there's no genes for addiction, and
right.
There's no.
But people always talk about. I mean, people name one all the time as though they were.
Well,
anyway, whatever.
There's a famous. There was an allele of a D2 dopamine.
That's it. That's it. They talk about.
Oh, he's still using that. Well, we're
allele.
talking about the right thing.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read. This is from my memoir. Do you remember the hullabaloo when the Human Genome Project commenced in 1990? It had the goal of, quote, mapping all of the genes in the human genome from both a physical and a functional standpoint. As a nation, we were feverish with the excitement that we were going to learn the genetic sources of human personality, behavior, and most assuredly and importantly, mental illness and addiction. Should I skip the trite explanation? How's that been working for you? No. No individual genes have been found for any illness, mental illness, alcoholism, or addiction. We now know that none of these exist. The overwhelming amount of DNA isn't organized at all into genes, but occurs in undifferentiated clumps along paired chromosomes of the genome. These configurations can be radically changed by random crossings of the chromosome strands and other environmental impacts. When the Human Genome Project was completed in 2003, there were no announcements of fabulous genetic discoveries that would soon eliminate all of the usual suspect conditions. As indeed I know throughout this memoir, mental disorders and drug and addiction and fatalities are the only things that have grown radically since we mapped the human genome. Despite this disappointing result, or maybe because of it, it is still commonplace for people to comment about personality, behavior, addiction, and mental illness. It's genetic. We disproved. So let's go into my second story, which was revealed to us by our colleague, Ann Earl, who works in the Life Process Program. She sent us something. Genetic addiction tests convert prison to treatment and rehabilitation. Now, that's an old story, isn't it? They're taking people out of prison. American treatment is overwhelmingly coerced by legal sources, and God bless them. The DPA is announcing the success of the Oregon Initiative 110, and they claim that it decriminalizes drugs, but it doesn't. If you're caught with drugs, they send you for an assessment. And they're now using marijuana funds from Oregon to increase the amount of addiction treatment.
Right.
America's a giant funnel into addiction treatment. To help, so this is what she sent us. To help understand the incarceration versus treatment evaluation, it is helpful to see blame from the judicial perspective. The American legal system presumes free will. Those stupid suckers, they think that people have a choice in their lives, and imparts criminal responsibility, but allows for the uncontrollable influence of determinism by providing tolerance of defenses or easing punishment. The idea of uncontrollable influence or determinism is an area of change in the legal system. I wouldn't call it change, that requires thought in the absence of binding earlier legal examples. About 2 years ago, 2 years ago, it's been going on for centuries, the effort was made to develop an acceptable treatment program that uses the genetic addiction risk severity GARS test. The GARS was developed by Kenneth Blum and described previously, this website is Sober World. Using the GARS test provided a legal example of evidence to help the courts choose. Ken Blum. I thought that Ken Blum was such a dead fish that I didn't even bother to mention him in my memoir. I avoid ever saying that Gabor Mate is a fraud because Archie said, you know, he's going to sue you. So I use the word charlatan, which, by the way, somebody that we interviewed used with me to describe Gabor Mate, because I was giving a workshop in British Columbia and somebody in the audience said, what about the fact that cocaine causes 1,000 times the intensity of experience of an orgasm? And this guy that you and I know was at my workshop. He said, 1,000 times an orgasm. Well, I'm getting kind of old. I have taken cocaine, and I guess I just wouldn't say, I wouldn't put it as 1,000 times stronger. And the guy who made that comment was quoting Gabor Mate, who's supposedly into harm reduction and supposedly believes that all addictions are equivalent. And then my colleague said, he's such a charlatan. But Ken Blum, I have called a fraud. I go back a long way with Ken Blum. You can look it up. Stanton Peele, Ken Blum, fraud. I wrote an article. He announced the discovery of a gene for alcoholism, the dopamine D2 allele, in 1990. And I wrote an article for the Atlantic magazine, not so fast, with the gene. It's called Second Thoughts About a Gene for Alcoholism. Nobody believes dopamine D2 allele causes alcoholism. And Ken Blum expanded it to include.
And Blum and Dr. Drew do, but that
another
class
fill
act.
in the blank.
Yeah.
So let's just turn to Wikipedia. By the way, Ken Blum, I've only been threatened with lawsuits twice in my life. The current head of the Division of Addiction at Harvard Medical School, Howard Schaefer, threatened me with a lawsuit when I lodged a complaint for plagiarism against him with the Harvard Medical School Review Board. But before that, I wrote a review of Ken Blum's kooky book, The Addictive Brain, and he sent me a letter. His lawyer sent me a letter threatening to sue me. And I forwarded a copy of the letter to the dean of the University of Texas Medical School at Austin, saying I don't usually get threatened with lawsuits when I write, a book review. I never heard from the dean, but here is now Ken Blum's Wikipedia entry, which has a note. We need some careful evaluations of this person. I haven't written anything in there. I've never written anything in the Stanton Peele Wikipedia entry, the life process model entry, the brain. I have no components in the Wikipedia. Ken Blum is a University of Texas pharmacologist who in 1990 claimed to discover an allele that genetically determined alcoholism for approximately 3/4 of alcoholics. This is me writing when I called him. The claim was preposterous on its face. Even those like Enoch Gordis, who strongly supported genetic determinism of alcoholism, thought the claim was a fake. Once at a conference I attended with Ken, I hawked copies of a newsletter I did entitled Ken Blum is a Fraud. God, I used to be wild. So we were at a conference and I was handing out papers. Ken was talking there. Did you know the guy actually markets a vitamin enzyme mixture that he says cures cocaine and other drug addictions, alcoholism, and obesity? Now I write something really cruel. I hope I'll be forgiven for it. It obviously doesn't cure hair loss if you look at the rug that Ken Blum wears on his head. Since at least previously vitamin mixtures were not subject to FDA approval, Ken could make any claims he wished for the elixir. I actually wrote this. If you're wondering whether Ken will sue me for this, do recall that Ken is the only person in the alcoholism addiction field who has ever threatened to sue me, which he did on a negative review I wrote on his ridiculous book, Alcohol and the Addiction Brain. In it, Ken claims he will cure obesity, alcoholism, and sexual compulsion, among other things, within another 10 years. So that was in 1990. Thank God he's cured all of those. The book is written in the breathless style of the double helix, as though it were the threshold of winning the Nobel Prize. In general, Ken is an example how if you label things genetic, you are guaranteed some kind of an audience, no matter how ludicrous your claims. His is the kind of bad science that flares up and disappears in a few years without a trace. But I was wrong. He's surfaced again. I couldn't believe he's still around. And Ann Earl wrote about us. This is how Wikipedia describes him. As I said, they said we need to be careful in discussing this man. We don't want to say anything that can, cause us to be sued for slander. I've written nothing. Ken Blum is an American scientist who has studied neuropsychopharmacology and genetics. Until 1995, he was a professor of pharmacology at the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio. What happened in 1995? How kind of mysterious, isn't it? That's right around when I was writing about him, when he was coming up. You figure if you discovered the gene for not only alcoholism, but all of addiction,
you're on the up and up.
Would be good.
Yeah.
Blum originated the term reward deficiency syndrome. This is from Wikipedia, not my writing. There is no consensus among addiction researchers that empirical evidence exists to justify such a concept. He holds multiple patents relating to genetic testing and treatment for I'm not making this word up, supposed syndrome that have been licensed through various different corporations. So Ken Blum has an industry going on where he's manufacturing these vitamins and doing this testing and curing every kind of addiction known to man. And now it's come back again. It's still out there. And she said one other thing, Ann said one other thing. The idea that addiction is genetic, her son was taught that in high school as though it's Newtonian physics.
Yeah, I was too.
Well, everybody knows it's genetic. And no actual genetic researcher in the world, Ken Blum's not a genetic researcher, believes that there's a gene for alcoholism and addiction. Nobody believes it. So now we come to the third story in my segue. The first was a guy writing in Medium whose parents were moderate drinkers who inherited the gene for alcoholism. then we got this newsletter where Ann is a part of a group of survivors with children who've had bad outcomes with drugs, where they're telling everybody to read this. Thank God we're going to be able to test people and get more of them into treatment. And now here's point 3, Nora Volkow. What the brain disorder model within the larger biosocial, psychosocial framework captures better than other models, such as those that focus on addiction as a learned behavior, is the crucial dimension of inter-individual biological variability that makes some people more susceptible than others to this hijacking, brain hijacking. Many people try drugs, but most do not start using compulsively or develop an addiction. I wonder why that is. Why different people use drugs and some become more or less compulsive about it. I wonder why some people get in love relationships and some become more or less compulsive and destructive about it. I wonder why that is.
It's a genetic mystery.
Studies are identifying gene variants that confer resilience or risk for addiction, as well as environmental factors in early life that affect that risk. This knowledge will enable development of precisely targeted prevention and treatment strategies, just as it is making possible the larger domain of personalized medicine. You know, they treat cancer differently now, depending upon your genetic thing. So she's jumping. And as I said, the single greatest argument against the genetic model of addiction, which she writes about now, is that most people settle down in their lives and overcome addiction. But we just don't know what causes that. So now Gene Heyman is a multivariate researcher. He's not a theoretician. The correlates of quitting is the way he thinks about it, of overcoming addiction, include the absence of additional psychiatric and medical problems, marital status, single stay addicted longer, economic pressures, fear of judicial sanctions, concern about respect from children and other family members, worries about the many problems that attend regular involvement in illegal activities, more years spent in school, a higher income. Put in more personal terms, this is Gene Heyman, addicts often say they had quit drugs because they wanted to be a better parent, make their own parents proud of them, and not further embarrass their families. In short, the correlates of quitting are the practical and moral concerns that affect all major decisions. They are not the correlates of recovery from the diseases addiction is said to be like, such as Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and so on. Much of what we know about quitting drugs has been provided by researchers who study addicts who are not in treatment. That mass of people who just quit their addictions eventually. This is me writing. This is a single consistent finding most difficult for Volkow et al. To explain away. But this is how Volkow deals with that. We still do not understand all the factors that make some people better able to recover than others, or the neurobiological mechanisms that support recovery. These are important areas for research. Oh, yes, we do understand them. Heyman just listed them all. But let's go back to 1962. Charles Winnick wrote in 1962, I often write about how when I was in graduate school in 1968, they had a giant article about drugs because drugs were big. And I read the whole damn article, and they interviewed Charles Winnick, and he said, heroin and other opioids are not inherently destructive drugs. The negative outcomes that regular consumers of these drugs encounter have to do with their lifestyles, which is what Carl Hart says. In 1962, this is what Charles Winnick wrote. Those addicted to heroin typically matured out, but those who failed to do so were, quote, those who decided that they are hooked, make no effort to abandon addiction, and give in to what they regard as inevitable. This rejection of individual agency underlies the Volkow NIDA It's really ties back to what you were talking about, Peterson. People who say, well, I was born to be an addict. I can't overcome it. I'm addicted to drugs. I've learned that you can't overcome an addiction, which is what MAT often tells people. The lie of the genetic disease model of addiction causes addiction, which everybody agrees is rising out of beyond all scope, and it makes it less possible for people to overcome it. It's the big lie. It's the same big lie, getting back to my talking about AOC, the same lie that drove people that the election was stolen from Trump to attack and abuse members of Congress. This is the big lie in the addiction field, and it has just as negative consequences.
And as you say, it's a lie that feeds on itself. You know, you believe it, then it makes things worse for you.
And so in the Life Process program, I mean, we don't do assessments of whether people are addicted or dependent, A. B, people often ask us if they're addicted or dependent.
Yep.
And this is like motivational interviewing. We say, well, why don't you tell me why you want to talk to me and what it is about your drinking, et cetera, that you're worried about? And then they'll tell you what problems they're having. And then we say, well, okay, why don't we think about each of those problems and how what you're doing in life and what you're doing with whatever it is you're worried about is contributing to those kinds of problems. But then we say to them, well, we don't believe that this set of problems, which could be called addiction, is basic to who you are. We don't believe it's genetic. We don't believe it's built into your personality. And we certainly don't believe it's permanent. A major part of our program is convincing people, sometimes unconvincing them of things they've learned previously. The Life Process program is built on a rehab I had, and I would go and talk to the residential clients. And it was always, I don't know what the right word is, amusing would be the wrong word. They would start arguing with, a guy had been in there, he'd flunked out of 9 or 10 rehabs. And he'd start, arguing about how it was genetic with him. And I said, well, that hasn't been working for you so well. Let's relax and think differently. We think differently about it. It's costing you or your parents or your family quite a bit of money to have you come here. So why don't we just try and take a different perspective on it and see if that works for you? We had to deprogram people from the disease model, from the genetic model, in order to help them first.
What an interesting model, because you want to be honest about everything you're doing. And again, it's almost like antithetical to motivational interviewing to tell people, come here and we'll deprogram you. You don't want to really say that. You just have to do it. What a tricky thing to get people outside of that story and back into life, like we were talking about with all the intellectuals we talk about.
Well, obviously, people came to a rehab where they're spending, I'll throw out a figure, $25,000, $35,000 a month. I don't get in arguments with them. I mean, even before I knew about, you tell them, well, why don't you relax that thinking? But when I do give a workshop, it's everybody. I've attended workshops that Carl gave. And afterwards, he introduces me. Somebody comes up to me and says, what he's saying is not true, is it? That people get over, narcotic withdrawal is sort of like a bad cold. And then I have to say to them, you're asking the wrong person if you want to get somebody to fight with Carl on that topic.
Right.
But nobody believes Carl. They don't believe Carl. They don't believe. I'm invited to give lectures and workshops at places where the title of the thing is Rethinking the Model of Addiction. Is addiction really disease? That's what they're going with. And people still, they all want to argue with me. And so I've come, and well, when you interviewed Carl, he, the world isn't changing its point of view because Carl's come out and said anything.
Yeah.
And, he says, well, I know what the data are, so I don't worry about it. I'm actually trying to, there's something the matter with me. I'm actually trying, the title of my memoir is A Scientific Life on the Edge. It was first called My Quest to Change How We See Addiction. I'm driven to change it. I'm like AOC. That's why I identify with her so much. I can't quit. And my new subtitle is My Quest to Defeat the Disease Concept of Addiction. Oh, the disease lie of addiction. That's what I call it. So I'm never going to give up that. I have a lifetime purpose because I feel it's the single thing that's most beneficial therapeutically for an individual and for society. And in reverse, we're creating an ever expanding realm of addiction and death from drugs by convincing people from grade school now that if they should develop a drug or whatever, of course, we're expanding the kind of gambling, gaming, sex problem, that's actually who they are genetically, and it's for the whole lives.